Let me ask you a question. When was the last time you looked at a resume and actually learned something meaningful about whether that person could do the job? I've reviewed thousands of resumes throughout my career, and I can tell you with absolute confidence that the traditional resume is one of the worst tools we have for predicting success at any job, let alone at a startup. We spend hours scanning for the right school, the right company name, and the right number of years in a role. And none of that tells you whether this person can walk into your chaotic, under resourced, and constantly shifting environment and actually deliver. Today, I am going to break down why skills based hiring is the single most effective change a startup can make to its recruitment process. And I will show you exactly how to implement it, even if you have a team of 10 and no dedicated recruiter.
Right.
Hello and welcome to Organized Chaos. I'm your host, Nahat Kerala. And for more than 15 years, I have consulted on HR and operations for over 150 startups across the globe. And I've built HR operations from scratch for multiple startups as the chief people officer. One of the patterns I have seen consistently across every geography, every industry, and every stage of growth is that the companies who hire based on demonstrated skills outperform the companies who hire based on credentials. According to a 2024 LinkedIn report, companies that use skills based hiring are 63% more likely to make a quality hire compared to those relying on traditional methods. Yet the vast majority of startups are still running the same broken playbook that enterprise companies use. They're filtering by degree, scanning for brand name employers, and making gut calls based on a few 45-minute conversations. That approach is expensive, slow, and it's statistically unreliable. Let's talk about why it fails and what you should be doing instead. So, let me start with talking about why resumes are a poor predictor of startup success. The resume was designed for a world that no longer exists. It was built to help large corporations sort through massive applicant pools by using proxies for competence, things like university prestige, years of tenure, and job titles. Those proxies might have some predictive value when you are hiring someone into a well defined role at a Fortune 500 company with established processes and a very clear chain of command. But at a startup, the job you're hiring for today will probably look very different in 6 months. The person you bring on needs to operate in ambiguity. They need to solve problems they have never seen before, and they're going to wear three different hats on any given Tuesday. A resume cannot tell you any of that. What it can tell you is where someone went to school and how long they stayed at their last company. Research from Harvard Business School and Accenture found that degree requirements screen out over 60% of qualified workers from roles they could successfully perform. Think about that for a second. You are automatically eliminating more than half of the people who could actually do the job simply because they hold a piece of paper from the right institution. I actually saw this at play in a Series A startup that I worked with more than 3 years ago. They were hiring their first product manager, and the founder insisted on candidates from top tier schools with at least 5 years of product experience at name brand companies. After 4 months of searching, they finally landed someone who checked every box on paper. But within 90 days, it became clear that this person could not function in the startup environment. He kept waiting for direction and didn't really have the proactivity required to succeed on that kind of job. This person needed established frameworks and a clear playbook that simply did not exist. He lasted 5 months before he and the company mutually agreed to part ways. Now, the replacement hire did not have a degree from a prestigious university and had never worked at a name brand company. She had spent 3 years running operations for a small e commerce company and 2 years freelancing as a product consultant for early stage companies. Her resume would have been easily filtered out by the original criteria, but she understood how to work with limited data, how to make fast decisions, and how to build processes from scratch. She is still there today and has become one of the most impactful leaders on that team. The core issue is that resumes highlight experience, and experience is a trailing indicator. It tells you what someone has already done in a specific context. What you actually need to know at a startup is whether this person can perform in your own context, which is almost certainly different from whatever environment they came from. Skills based hiring flips the script by measuring what someone can do right now. So let's talk about what is skills based hiring and what does it look like in practice. When I talk about skills based hiring, I am not suggesting that you throw out every part of your existing process. You still need to understand a candidate's background and motivations. What changes, though, is where you place the emphasis and how you make the final decision. The first shift is in how you write your job descriptions. Most startup job descriptions are essentially wish lists. They ask for 7 years of experience, a specific degree, proficiency in 12 different tools, and expertise in a domain that has only existed for 3 years. If you've tried to recruit for any role, you already know that this approach attracts people who are good at matching keywords on their resumes, regardless of whether they are good at the actual work. Instead, you need to define the job in terms of outcomes. What does this person need to accomplish in their first 90 days? What specific problems will they need to solve? What decisions will they need to make independently? For example, instead of writing 5+ years of experience in B2B SaaS marketing, you can write something like ability to design and execute a demand generation strategy that produces a qualified pipeline on a budget under $50,000 per quarter. The first version only filters by time served, whereas the second version filters by capability. The candidate pool you attract with the second version will look very different, and in my experience, it will be significantly stronger. The second shift is in your screening process. Instead of spending 30 minutes on a phone screen asking someone to walk you through their resume, you give them a short practical exercise. I mean a focused 30 to 45-minute exercise that mirrors a real task they would encounter on the job. For a marketing hire, it might be drafting a campaign brief given a specific scenario. For an engineer, it might be a programming session on a real problem from your codebase. For a sales hire, it might be a mock discovery call. The third shift you need to make is in how you evaluate candidates during the interview itself. You need to move from unstructured conversations where every interviewer asks whatever they feel like to structured interviews where each person on the panel is assessing a specific skill against a defined rubric. This matters because unstructured interviews have been shown to be only slightly better than flipping a coin when it comes to predicting job performance. Research by Frank Schmidt and John Hunter, which was published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, found that structured interviews combined with work sample tests are among the strongest predictors of actual on the job success. I once worked with a growing retail chain that made this switch. Before the change, they were running a typical process: resume screen, phone screen, 3 rounds of unstructured interviews, and a final founder gut check call. Their mishire rate was roughly around 40%, meaning nearly half of their hires were either let go or quit within the first year. After we redesigned the process around skills based assessments and structured interviews, their mishire rate dropped to under 15% within the first year. They also cut their average time to hire by about 2 weeks because the process gave them much higher confidence in their decisions. Now, let's talk a bit about assessment methods that work for small teams. One of the most common objections I hear from founders is that skills based hiring sounds great in theory, but they don't have the resources to design assessments, build rubrics, and train interviewers. I understand the concern, but the reality is that you are already spending those resources. You are spending them on bad hires, extended searches, and the productivity loss that comes from bringing on the wrong person. The investment in a better process pays for itself after a single avoided mishire. Here are the assessment methods I recommend for small teams, ranked by impact and ease of implementation. The first and most powerful method is the work sample test. You take a real problem from your business, anonymize it if needed, and ask the candidate to solve it. The key is keeping it short and relevant. You are not asking them to do free consulting work. You're asking them to demonstrate how they think and execute on a task that closely mirrors what they're actually going to be doing on the job. For a customer success hire, you might present them with a real support ticket escalation and ask how they would handle it. For an operations hire, you might give them a messy process and ask them to map out how they would improve it. The second method is the structured behavioral interview. This is where you ask every candidate the same set of questions, each one designed to assess a specific competency, and you score their answers on a predefined scale. The questions should be behavioral, meaning they ask the candidate to describe a specific situation they faced, what they did, and what the outcome was. You're looking for evidence of the skill in action, not hypothetical answers about what they would do in a made up scenario. The third method, and this is one I highly encourage if it's available to you, is the paid trial project. Instead of trying to evaluate someone in a few hours of interviews, you bring them in for a paid 1 to 2 day trial where they work alongside your team on a real project. This gives you an incredibly rich data set. You see how they communicate, how they handle ambiguity, how they collaborate, and whether they can actually produce the quality of work you need. It also gives the candidate a chance to evaluate you, which reduces the risk of early turnover because they know exactly what they're signing up for. Now, I want to be specific about one thing. Paid trial projects must be compensated fairly. If you ask someone to spend 2 days working on your problems, you need to pay them a fair day rate. Anything less is exploitative and will damage your employer brand. The same thing applies for the short project. If you want to give them something which takes them more than a 45-minute call, maybe like a take home test or exam or case study, then make sure that you set an hourly rate which is relevant to the job at hand and compensate them fairly. Now, the fourth method is reference checks done right. Most founders either skip references entirely or treat them as a formality. A skills based reference check means you ask the reference to evaluate specific competencies rather than just asking if the candidate was a good employee. You might say something like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this person's ability to work independently with minimal direction? You can follow it up by something like, can you give me a specific example of when they demonstrated that? This approach gives you much more actionable information than the standard reference call. Okay, let's talk about how to sell this approach to skeptical founders. If you're an HR leader or a hiring manager trying to push this change within your startup, you're probably going to face resistance. Founders tend to trust their gut, and many of them have had at least one successful hire that came through a traditional process, which reinforces their belief that the old way works. Here's how I coach people to make the case. First, lead with the cost of a bad hire. Founders understand money. The average cost of a mishire at a startup, when you factor in salary, lost productivity, team disruption, and replacement costs, runs between $100,000 and $250,000 depending on the role. According to the US Department of Labor, a bad hire can cost up to 30% of the employee's first year earnings. And that estimate is conservative for startups where every person has an outsized impact. When you frame skills based hiring as a risk mitigation strategy that protects the company's capital, founders start paying attention. Second, propose a pilot rather than a full overhaul. Do not walk into the conversation asking to redesign the entire hiring process overnight. Instead, suggest running a skills based process for the next 2 or 3 hires and measuring the results against your historical data. Track things like time to hire, candidate quality scores, and 90-day retention. If the data supports the change, you will have a much easier time scaling it across the company. Third, make it easy for the founder to participate. Build the rubrics, design the work samples, and write the structured interview questions yourself. Hand the founder a one-page scorecard and say, all you need to do is ask these 3 questions and rate the answers on this scale. When you remove the friction, you remove the objection. Most founders resist new processes because they assume it means more work for them. Show them it actually means less work and better outcomes. Fourth, share the data. I referenced the LinkedIn study earlier showing that skills-based companies are 63% more likely to make a quality hire. Test Gorilla's 2023 State of Skills-Based Hiring report found that 92% of companies that adopted skills-based hiring saw a reduction in mishires. McKinsey research has shown that skills-based organizations are 60% more likely to achieve positive outcomes than those still focused on credentials. The evidence is overwhelming, and founders who pride themselves on being data driven should be willing to follow where the data leads. The last point I will make here is that you need to be patient. Changing how a company hires is a cultural shift, and cultural shifts just take time. You will face setbacks. A hiring manager will skip the rubric and make a gut call. A founder will override the process because they just have a feeling about a candidate. When that happens, don't get frustrated. Document the outcome, and when the data eventually proves your point, use it to reinforce the case for the process. Most founders come around after they see the results with their own eyes. The reason most startups still hire based on credentials rather than skills comes down to the same root cause behind so many HR failures. And that's defaulting to what feels familiar instead of doing what actually works. Founders copy the hiring practices they experienced at their previous jobs, which were usually larger companies with very different needs. They rely on resumes because that is what they know. They trust gut instinct because structured evaluation feels bureaucratic and slow. But here's the thing: skills based hiring is actually faster for startups, not slower. When you define the job by outcomes, you attract candidates who are already aligned with what you need. When you use work samples, you compress weeks of uncertainty into a single evaluation. And when you use structured interviews, you make better decisions with fewer rounds. The entire process becomes tighter and more efficient, which is exactly what a resource constrained startup needs. The companies I have worked with that made this shift consistently report three outcomes. Number one, they hire faster because they waste less time on candidates who look good on paper but cannot perform. Number two, they hire better because they are measuring the things that actually predict success. And number three, they have longer retention because the people they bring in know exactly what the job requires and have already demonstrated they can do it. Your people are the single biggest investment your startup will make. Every dollar you spend on salary, every hour you spend interviewing, and every bet you place on a new hire either compounds in your favor or compounds against you. Skills based hiring tips those odds dramatically in your direction. And the best part is that you can start implementing it tomorrow with zero budget and a small team. That is the full breakdown on skills based hiring for startups. We covered why resumes fail as a predictor of startup success, what a skills based process actually looks like in practice, which assessment methods work best for lean teams, and how to get buy in from skeptical founders. If this episode gave you something useful, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening. It helps more founders and HR professionals find the show, and that is ultimately what keeps this content coming every week. You can also head over to organizedchaos.fyi for more resources, templates, and to book a free consultation if you want help implementing any of this at your company. Well, that's it for this week's episode, and I'll see you on the next one.